April, hello, how are you? I'm so glad you are here to chat
Thank you
with
so much
us.
for having me. Yeah, this is exciting.
And I had so much fun chatting with you about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, about literally everything mystical, creative, so much so that we couldn't stop talking. And we're like, wait a minute, we have the whole stars and universe to talk about.
I love that.
So this time we're bringing James into the conversation, but we want to hear about you. Will you tell us about yourself and what exactly you do?
My name is April Kling Meyer. I am the founder of, I guess we'll call it a movement called Creativity is Spirituality. And at the moment, the movement, but eventually I see broader application as being more of a media production company. And Creativity is Spirituality really kind of contains the whole idea, the whole driving force behind what I do. It's three magical words that really just encapsulate everything that I'm trying to, the word that I'm trying to spread. And I'm also an interfaith seminary student. I'm halfway through the ordination to my ordination, so that's exciting. I'm a student at One Spirit Foundation UK, and I also do one-on-one and group facilitating, coaching. I create emotionally expressive experiences for people to engage with art and creativity and ritual in order to release people from the effects of trauma and to envision a better future for themselves and the world. So that's what I do. And there's so much more to it than that, but that's the elevator speech right there.
Absolutely. I want to ask a little bit more. James, are you okay with that?
Come on.
Okay. It piques my interest. You brought up a hot topic, and that's trauma. How does creativity and trauma correlate? And what might be an intersection and possibly a healing journey within the two?
That's a really wonderful and intricate question. I really can only speak from my own experience and what I've witnessed in this work that matches with that, which is to say that as far as my own trauma goes, I have stored of trauma in my own body. And when I mean I've stored it into my body, it exhibits itself in the form of physical pain. And that's what part of what drew me into this work was that being able to express oneself can release us from not just emotional but physical pain. And the only way that I have found that addresses that, aside from the medical community, which in my experience has failed me, but I still trust in it as much as I possibly can. There's really no other choice. But I have to supplement that with alternative forms of medicine, and I also have to supplement that with my own practices. I became very rapidly addicted to exercise and dieting at one point in my life, and I didn't find any form of meaningful release from pain or trauma in that process, even though that seemed to be promised at the end of that journey, only to discover that there was no end to that journey.
Mm.
But at the end of that journey, I did discover the art of, well, the the creative alchemy process, which was devised by a woman by the name of Melissa D'Antoni, and she is a trained psychotherapist who devised this technique to allow oneself to be completely removed from expectations that put on ourselves, or put on us by the people who created trauma for us, by our oppressors, by our abusers, to really examine those forces that we put on ourselves that generally exhibit in perfectionism
Mm.
and the inability to move forward with certain things in our lives, and go forward towards goals, have meaningful and fulfilling relationships. I mean, the effects of trauma really are so widespread. And in this technique, we essentially just completely remove ourselves from outcome and expectation, and we throw ourselves into the paint physically. We
Mm.
involve our entire bodies in this process. The piece of paper is almost as big as us. The easel is larger than myself. I'm 5'4", and we use our entire bodies to get this paint onto the canvas in an expressive way. It involves a lot of damping and noise. There's yelling, crying, screaming, howling. And as you can imagine, in the past year now, in the time of a pandemic, it's been really hard to facilitate such things on Zoom.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've tried. It can be done, just very scaled down.
Okay.
So, the process itself, I can't really give too much into that, but I will say that you, in the very beginning of the process, to identify something that's bothering you,
Mm.
be it emotional or physical, and just kind of get to the source of it. You do a lot of muscle testing to see kind of what age it was where that pain kind of first appeared for you. And from there, you monitor the extremes of that pain. Like what does it feel like on a scale of 1 to 10? And then you check in at the end of the process to see if that pain has reduced for you, that intensity of the emotion or the intensity of the physical pain.
Mm.
It's really the first time I'd ever received any therapy that addressed that physical pain and emotional pain have so much intersection, and that can be expressed. It doesn't promise to cure, but it does promise some tremendous relief from either one, actually. And you just look at it from that point of view. If you start off that process with an 8 and you walk away from that process with as a 6,
Mm.
it's at least moving in the right direction. But more often than not, it's something, when I bring clients into this process or myself into this process, it starts off pretty high, and then I personally walk away with something more like a 3 or a 4. And there's so much more to it than that, but to me, it's really brought me face to face on the canvas with my emotions in physical form,
Yes.
where I can see what color they are and and I can shape them. I can make them take a shape that I can interact with and move and change. And that's a really powerful have, to be able to see your shapes and colors of your own trauma right in front of you, and to be able to manifest it looking differently, it taking a different shape, adding different colors, that sort of thing.
I have found that in the midst of trauma, it's often hard to use words to express feelings in the beginning. Is that some of the purpose in why you do these workshops and what you found?
Absolutely, because words just don't cover it. And we have to also remember that some of the most potent trauma happens before we're able to form words.
Mm.
I would say that being birthed, being conceived, all of the ancestral trauma that
Mm.
happened before our conception, all
Mm.
of the trauma that happened to both of our parents while, before we were born, that's brought into this process as well quite frequently. And then that's a whole 2 or 3 years, depending on your own personal development. And if you're traumatized at an early age, it could be 4 or 5 or older before you're able to even process and understand language and words. You have to be able to bring that sort of trauma to the canvas as well.
Mm.
So it has, by nature, it has to transcend words. It has to go beyond something that can be explained, and it really does have so much to do with the way the body expresses itself. I've also found similar release in dance, which
Mm.
also is a way of expressing ourselves without words. I mean, I know that in ballet and in jazz dance, there's terms for the things we do with our bodies, like pirouette and ball change and twirl and those sorts of things. But those are words we've added to something that already existed. And so yeah, it is something that I have a I like to call her a colleague, but really she's so much more than that. Maria Jordan O'Reilly here in Ireland. Some of the most like the thing that she just repeats over and over again in her work is that words just don't cut it.
Yeah.
Words just don't cut it.
Yeah.
Can I have a go now?
You may. I love you, James. Thank you.
Well, that's the end of the show. Thanks for joining us, everybody. April.
Bye-bye.
You may cut me off now.
We'll keep that in for the outtake. One of the things in The Body Keeps the Score, the book about trauma that's very popular, he talks about type of the movement that you've just talked about. So dance, people do yoga, gymnastics, those kind of things. And he talks about kind of a Western spirituality that hasn't emphasized body movement in a way that maybe Eastern spirituality has. So maybe a question I have is, how does that creativity, movement, and then spirituality what's the kind of relationship between that? And maybe another question is, how's your spirituality changed for you in your own life and like journey? So there's a two-part question there. Yeah.
Well, creativity, it involves movement. And so I'll speak to it from that angle. Creativity and spirituality used to have far more of a widespread in our past. It used to have far more of a widespread understanding of being the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at ancient cultures, people expressed their spiritual beliefs through painting and through movement. And we can go back to caveman times and see that the walls were covered with their stories and their beliefs. We can look at the ancient Nile Delta area and see that, hieroglyphs were a way of capturing beliefs and experiences and stories. And then in Western culture, we moved away from that. And I I feel like it was something that happened, and this is really very, very loose studies of my own, but there was something that happened around the Renaissance, I think, where artists began to be commissioned for work that was religious in nature. And I think that I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole because really what started to happen around that time too is just the whole idea of capitalism. And I think that we started to equate talent with monetary, um, the ability to like artistic talent and creativity itself. We started to equate that with one's own ability to make money and to be wealthy. And I think that's kind of where Western society, it may not have been the Renaissance, it may have been further back, it may have been more recent, and that's more a good question for a historian. But what hasn't changed is that creativity still can be entwined with spirituality, and we can get back to that. But we just have to remove ourselves from these ideas that in order for our creativity to have value, it has to have monetary value, or that it has to make us, it has to look a certain way, and then it has to get us validation. Because I have to tell you, I've seen whole entire lives change through my work, including my own. And in my clients, it's actually for my clients, it's actually costing them money to do this, and it's changing their entire lives, right? So that art that we do in these expressive arts, it's ugly. It's not frameable 99% of the time. Every once in a while, you'll end up with something quite lovely and you could take a picture of it. We don't even use archival quality anything. We use very cheap stuff. And we even encourage our participants to burn their work once it's dried, simply because you want that. For one thing, it's a fantastic way to ritualize this symbolic journey that you undertake with interacting with your own trauma on a piece of paper and then taking it and burning it and then releasing it to the elements, but also because the removal of outcome really so important to anyone who's undergone any kind of trauma that's affected their own view of their own creative expression in a way that feels oppressive or involves any kind of perfectionism. Because as you probably both saw on Twitter just a couple days ago, I really went there and saying that perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor, which is not my words. I'm merely parroting many other healers in this regard, and particularly women of color. But perfectionism is the voice of the oppressors, and it's also the voice of our abusers. That idea that we can't do anything right is something that we pick up on from people in our culture that would have us believe that we're less than them. And it's also something that we pick up from the people who abuse us. So it's really important to remove ourselves from outcome for that reason, because if we make something with the intention of it being ugly or imperfect, and we engage with it as if it is ugly and imperfect, yet very important and very essential, it really opens up a whole lot of avenues of being able to use creativity in a way that doesn't necessarily have to intersect with beauty in the traditional sense. Any kind of aesthetic quality that is sought for a process is going to de- potentially very detrimental to the ability of being able to express yourself and express your feelings.
I want to ask you, April, you're getting ready to lead some more workshops, and I want to hear about that. What are your goals for the workshops in the future, and what are you leading right now? How can we be involved in this?
Wow. Well, at the moment, I just completed my first year of seminary, and I have a very narrow window in order to maybe throw something together group wise,
Mhm.
or take on new clients. It's really become very clear to me that running workshops really kind of have to be. I really am not going to be putting together anything of my own production anytime soon. I think really what I'm envisioning for that work is for groups to approach me to come and facilitate something that they're already producing and planning. And there's really strong reasons for that. Um, I've really done some self examination in the last year as I've kind of taken a hiatus from selling and planning and producing while I've been in school.
Mm.
And I really feel like the art of selling and the art of marketing and the art of putting together events is its own art. And I am currently in the process of taking on um, partnerships that will allow those types of things to happen outside of my ability to do the work. I understand that when a business is just starting out, that it's going to be 70% sales and marketing and 30% the work, the work itself. I'm trying to change that ratio right now, um, because it's really become very important for me to focus that ratio more on doing the work of working with people,
Mm.
face to face. And I was I was asked recently, well, do you think you need more coaching? Do you think that you just need somebody to coach you through this, like a business coach? I said, no, I think the money that I would spend on a business coach, I would actually need to just spend on somebody to do the work, do the sales and marketing stuff. So, how you can support me in that? If you're listening to me talking and it sounds like it's making a whole lot of sense, and you yourself would like to engage with this type of work with me, I would suggest starting at my Patreon page and becoming a member. €5 or $5 a month is just a great place to start. Plus, a lot of it's public. There's a lot you can read and interact with, and everything past a year, everything that's a year or older, is now all public, to make it free and accessible to everybody. And then another way that you could engage with that is for free completely is just to listen to my podcast, Creativity is Spirituality, available on anywhere that podcasts are distributed, Apple, Google. Anchor is where I produce it, but you can also listen to it at anchor.fm
Mm.
and Spotify. And then as far as groups go, I'm really hoping that groups will start coming together, people who are putting together events as groups or groups that regularly meet that want this type of work to be a part of what they do in their own mission to reach out to me and bring me in as a guest or a speaker. I'd like to do more of that sort of thing rather than build events from the ground up, which I had been doing. And one last thing, if you are a spiritual or creative worker who wants somebody to collaborate with, I'm open to that too.
I love that.
Can I ask a bit about the podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, how long's the podcast been going? What have you learned through it? What, have you got any favourite guests or any embarrassing moments? Just anything at all about the podcast that in you doing that for the last whatever, couple of years, maybe, how long that's been going.
Well, I love talking about my podcast. I think we're coming up on a year of me just saying yes to podcasts. I actually started my podcast with a completely different name and a completely different focus. And I only had 3 episodes in my first season. And the whole idea around that was dream work, which was really potent work for me at the beginning of the pandemic. Last spring, it seemed like everybody was talking about the intensity of their dreams because everybody was, going into quarantines and isolating, and they started having really intense dreams. So I stepped up because I know how to teach people how to dream journal very efficiently and effectively, and to interpret dreams, but not just the dreams themselves, but the patterns that we have as individuals too, the way that we dream, how to analyze that from different standpoints, like what did I dream about this week, what did I dream about in the last month, looking at a whole journal and saying what's coming up for me as a theme as I've dreamed this through this journal or this year, however long that journal will cover. So I started teaching that, and that became really, really important to people at that very tiny sliver of time. And the moment that West started reopening in June, all of that work just kind of, I don't know, it just kind of disappeared. I was no longer able to get podcast guests that were willing to come and be on the show. Plus, it's very private, very personal stuff that we talk about on podcasts like that. And that became very difficult to get guests to do that. So I hit a wall and I pivoted, and I decided to make it about the greater body of work that I'm doing, creativity is spirituality. And that's when I really started to own that phrase too. Like, I changed everything over from what I had been calling myself, really just April Kling Meyer. And I started to think of it as something that was broader and something that could exist beyond my death, even, as creativity is spirituality. Thinking of it as like a movement, a collective of people. I renamed the podcast. I changed everything over on social media to creativity is spirituality at that point. And I started having guests talk about that, and it just seemed like it's like I couldn't book people fast enough. Everybody wants to talk about creativity and spirituality. So the first season of that, which is the second season of my whole podcast, that's 15 episodes. And I feel like that really set the pace for just everything that's going to happen from now on. The podcasts, I really hadn't ever listened to a podcast until I moved abroad, and it became like a great way to just feel like I was a part of a conversation without so much energy, without having to use so much energy,
Yeah.
and be a part of something. And I felt like if I was in radio years and years and years ago, and there's a great deal of perfection that is required for recording stuff for radio and being a DJ on the radio, not tumbling over one's own words and things like that. But I found that podcasts, actually listening to podcasts, there's quite a lot of forgiveness there to just be yourself and be so delightfully imperfect and make the conversation about something that is just straight from the heart, and you can say the wrong thing and correct yourself and not have to say stop, record over that, not really even have to edit so much as I thought I would have to. So I really opened up that journey of perfectionism, and moving away from perfectionism really opened up podcasts for me. I started to have really, really deep and engaging conversations in my life at that point, and I started thinking, I want to get this on a podcast. So I started inviting people into my podcast, including my own brother, who is not a spiritual person and really wouldn't even consider himself a terribly creative person, even though he is. And really getting people to kind of give me a slice of their own perspective. I've had everybody from mystics and gurus to atheists and questioning agnostics. I don't feel like spirituality is too much of a gatekeep for me. I'm for having, I mean, for heaven's sake, I'm being ordained as an interfaith minister in a year. And I really want that to be in a conversation anyone can have, because the whole point of creativity is spirituality. The podcast and anything else I do with it is to have people start to think about taking ownership of their creativity in a way that they take part of their spirituality. And we've kind of made a, like you've said, James, about Western culture. In Western culture, we've pretty much allowed both of those entities in our life to be sold to the highest bidder. If we're not careful, it's a really strong temptation. So making those things one and the same and realizing that we can claim full ownership of those within ourselves is the focus of the podcast. Every question I ask on that podcast is to that end. One thing that I did feel like on every podcast I make a mistake, and I feel like that means I'm doing it right. And I know that sounds odd, but since you do podcasts, you might know what that's like. Every podcast I make a mistake.
We have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Absolutely.
Oh no!
Not a single idea what we're talking about. I mean, our shows just go flows just very calmly. There's no outtakes. There's no. I don't need to do any editing whatsoever.
I just edit half of what I say because I'm all over the place. So we know.
just perfect.
Yes.
Every time.
On my show one time who had experienced a trauma that was so dynamic in their life that everything changed. And I have a question on my boilerplate outline of questions that I send to everyone to tell me about your background, tell me about your spiritual and religious upbringing. And I didn't consider that person maybe didn't have any interest whatsoever in discussing that, even though I sent that prior to the conversation. It became something that I felt needed to pivot in the second season, so it has, unless I know explicitly that person has discussed it before and is willing to discuss it. But I really feel like that guest did an immaculate job of explaining to the audience and to me the importance of a spiritual legacy as opposed to a religious or spiritual background. And knowing that even though you may not have ancestors that you can relate to, or a family that you care to discuss, an identity that you care to discuss openly on a podcast, you still have the right to claim legacy of your creativity and of your spirituality, your teachers and their lineages, and the traditions from which you have picked up in your chosen life and your family to carry forward. So that has really been an important lesson in vulnerability, because I'm the kind of person that I'm an open book. I'll tell you anything you want to know, but my limit is merely, does this story belong to somebody else? When I'm talking about something that's happened to me, I don't necessarily want to go into everybody's perspective or what happened to everybody else in that story, because it's not my story to tell. And that's a really hard and fast rule for me, but that's not the limit for everyone else. Sometimes the limit for everyone else is I don't speak about anything before the age of 16, and I have to respect that. And that's, it's always going to be a dance. There's never going to be two people who respond to different questions the same. And there's also such a wide and vast array of triggers out there when you talk about this type of stuff. I mean, creativity and spirituality is a minefield of triggers. So it's a dance that I feel very capable of doing. I just have to be willing to learn important lessons about it along the way. As for next season, though, coming up, I have I got Andrew Harvey to be on my podcast for season 3. So I am super excited about that, because you know how they always say, like, do something that scares you every day.
Yes.
Asking Andrew Harvey to be on my podcast scared the ever-loving you-know-what out of me. But he said yes, and I can't believe he said yes. And the interview happened last week, and it was brilliant and beautiful, and I can't wait to publish it. So that's just a little secret that's going to be on your podcast and on my paywall on my Patreon as well. That's only news that I'm telling you and your listeners, and then anybody who subscribes to my Patreon. That's the only people who know so far.
I'm so excited. There's something very sacred, and I believe we've talked about this, but there's something so sacred about I always say gathering at the table, and I use that symbolically, really. But gathering at the table, sharing stories, telling stories, and that goes back to, it goes back through history, and it's very cultural, where families and friends would gather at the table, share a meal, and share stories. And it's something that's been lost, I think, in Western culture often. But that's kind of what podcasts are offering now, inviting friends to come to our table, inviting guests to come to our table and share a sacred moment. And so what you were saying was reminding me of that. I was having all these images of my mind of exactly that. You're inviting people to your podcast to share sacred moments. And in those sacred moments, we're going to make mistakes, right? And this is everything I was kind of imagining with you as you were speaking. We're going to make mistakes, but that's what this is all about, to learn from each other and to grow together. And I want to hear your experience in that, in those sacred moments. Those sacred moments when you invite people to the table. What have you learned? Like, what have you learned through this whole process?
I've learned not to ignore that feeling of wanting to capture what is potentially a very good thing to hear. Um, Part of the journey of even beginning a podcast for me was just convincing myself that I had anything that I could even add to the conversation of all podcasts that are. I really kind of felt like everybody like was already talking about this and was doing a better job than I ever could. And I realized how wrong I was, because there's somebody that I meet even when I've been on lockdown for the better part of a year. I'm still meeting people online all the time that are encountering the things that I am merely regurgitating, really, that I have encountering things I have to say, and that they're learning something or gaining something from it. So, Brene Brown is having a podcast. Like, she's amazing. She's talking about a lot of the same things I'm talking about, and she's far more well known. And she's going to interview people like, gosh, that have published books, and people that have TV shows, or, were the first lady of the United States. She's going to interview people like that, because that's the kind of caliber of entertainer and healer that she is. I don't get access to people at that quantity, but that doesn't mean that the conversations are not just as valid and are something that people could really gain something beautiful from. And the pivotal moment for me, I think, was attending the Shamanism World Summit last year. I'm not in training to be a shaman. I'm not a shamanic practitioner, but I live in deep respect of that type of work and of shamanism in general. And I attended the Shamanism World Summit, and I heard the conversations that were happening very organically, and live. And I thought to myself, like, I've never heard of these people, but they have built communities. Well, not everybody. I mean, obviously Andrew Harvey I'd heard of, and people that had been on so many different sizes and scopes of stages in this work, and have held audiences of all kinds. And um, it really was so beautiful the way that summit brought together all these different people that I have and haven't heard of. And then organically and, you know, organically and just very naturally had conversations with those people. And it was podcast like in that regard. But I thought to myself, there's people in my world that no one's ever heard of that have taught me a million beautiful things. My brother's actually a perfect example of that. He's not an artist of any like known quantity, out in the world, but he is a leader, and he's taught me so much about loving and trusting myself, which, I mean, I think he was really the original person that told me that it was important to love myself. And I felt like that was a conversation that I wish I had recorded when we had it when I was a teenager. But instead, I had him on the podcast to talk about it, right? So, I get these opportunities to have these natural conversations with everyday people, and also with people who are more getting to be more well known or would like to be well known. I'm not able to really offer at this time any more than what they've got. But maybe there's just somebody who stumbles upon those words, creativity, spirituality, when they're searching for a new podcast to listen to, and they're going to find these normal, everyday people that are taking leadership and ownership of their spiritual lives and practices, their creativity, and who have something to say. And it became more of like a scrapbook than like a production. It became more of just capturing the moments. And one thing that I learned from that shamanic summit that happened last summer too was that community is something that arises spontaneously in a moment. You can form a community by witnessing a car accident on a street corner. Suddenly a community arises and forms out of that moment. And that I can create that community every time I have a new guest on the show. And with everybody who listens to it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I've got another question. I'm very intrigued with what you were saying earlier on. So this is kind of my own personal world exclusive. You've let us know that there's a guest appearing on your podcast that's a world exclusive. So my world exclusive is maybe slightly more personal. I'm just trying to find it now. In that, just kind of doing a bit more art and creativity, and some people have seen that through some of the poems or things I've done and put them on blog. I'm trying to find something here that I'm prepared to put on the screen. I can't find where I did it. That's really annoying. Anyway, I'll find it for the edit. So doing the kind of art and poetry things that I've been doing in terms of like processing healing trauma, you've talked about your workshops. How does creativity for you stay that fun thing if it's also part of a work thing for you? Is that like, and we can edit this out if you don't want to answer, but I'm just wondering, because I'm only doing this in terms of like personal like enjoyment and just working through lots of like layers of trauma and like all the negative messages and trying to just work through all that, but doing it for fun. But I'd say it's never a work thing. So how do you kind of do it as a fun? How do you keep it fun for you?
Play. It's just has to be seen as play. And I don't live, and I have to just really preface what I'm about to say by saying that I exist so fully in good fortune and privilege to be able to say this, because it's not something that's going to be accessible for everybody. And it's not, and I don't think that's fair. And I do think that there are oppressive forces that act on my life and in everyone's life to make this almost impossible. But I am able, by the grace of God, to exist in such a way that work and play are the same thing for me. Mm-hmm. And I have also worked very hard to make that possible, but I cannot sit here and say that I have myself to thank, because that has so much to do with my ability to exist in privilege and my ability to trust in the community and the family and the partner that I have to allow for that to happen. And that could easily be used to discount my work, but I just have to keep working / playing and keep honing that craft in order to prove that to myself, because that really is all that matters. Really succinctly, more succinctly put, to make a short story even longer, and to make that short again, and practice, just daily practice, discipline has become really the whole point. Like, I'm surrounded by sports people. My household is my spouse, who's a professional coach, and my child, who is an athlete. And I never really understood sports until I met my partner. And I get how much creativity and sports have in common, having lived in this household for 12 years. But it really is so much about, in sports, it's so much about remembering the passion, remembering what part of you brought you to the sport. And I have to go back to that every single day of my life. What brought me here? What brought me to believing in creativity being a spiritual outlet? And I indulge in that every day. and I just happen to have this handy next to me. But what you can't see if you're listening and you on Zoom there that are interviewing me is that I'm utterly surrounded by books like this of all shapes, colors, and sizes that are just absolutely packed with work. But that doesn't like look like work to me. It looks like play, right? But I make myself do it every day. It has so much to do with just the practice and the discipline and the process of going there every single day. Every single day. I used to have um, Artist Way morning pages, big deal for me. Julia Cameron's Artist Ways, something that I happened upon on my creativity spiritual path. A lot of people think it came from that. It actually didn't. But I happened upon our Artist Way along this path and started doing morning pages. So that's one thing. Dream journaling is another thing, obviously. Pulling tarot cards is another thing. Um, and just keeping a grimoire. And then these alchemical pieces of art that I just showed you that I keep notebooks of, you know. And it used to be that I felt, and meditation and yoga, and it used to be the stack of things I felt like I had to do every single day. Like if I don't check all of these boxes, then I haven't had a productive day or a useful day, or I haven't done it. I really thought of myself as like, oh, I didn't really do anything if I didn't do everything.
Mm.
And only recently have I started to say, if I do one or two of those things every single day, that's a pretty damn good discipline. That's a pretty damn good, like, daily spiritual practice to get myself into. If I draw something and I pull one tarot card and write about it, that's a pretty good day. If I do yoga and only yoga, that's a pretty good day. So I have now, I'm starting to treat those practices, that discipline, like a menu that I can order from every single day. Like I can get this and that, or I could just get this. And if I'm able to order from that menu every day, then I will consider myself a disciplined practitioner.
I love, I love the idea of play as a lifestyle. And I've actually met play therapists, which is very intriguing to me. And then,
Yeah.
of course, art as therapy, and both being healing practices. How do you keep play alive in your spirit? Like that childlike play, that childlike freedom. How do you keep that alive? Or how do you create a space for it to be alive?
I think allowing things to be free and ugly and imperfect really is how I invite my inner child in things, because a lot of my work um, expresses a childlike energy, but a lot of it doesn't.
Mm.
I really don't know how else to invite the child in besides just making sure that there's just no aesthetic drive behind it, but that the drive is to merely express. Um, and I also feel very strongly to again refer to Julia Cameron's work, because I feel like that's kind of another part of things that what something that she teaches is, which is basically like to go out into the world and see what you can see. Like go out and explore the world. Take a walk in nature. Take me to the five and dime and buy a pack of stickers, she says. I'm almost directly quoting here in that book. To go and like buy yourself a little treat. But but she also stresses to do this alone. Like very alone. And that's not something that struck me at first as feeling like it would be very healing for me, being very, very alone. But that really is, there's something to it. I think all of my childhood memories, of course, I was kind of the child of neglect to some extent, just by nature of just how things were, where I was growing up, and how things were for my parents and everything. It was kind of an unfortunate circumstance of my childhood was that I was alone a lot. So that is very associated with childhood trauma for me. But it's also the source of a lot of beautiful moments in childhood, just being alone and really having my own thoughts to myself and being able to do whatever it is I wanted to do in my own space. Because those were also moments of safety for me when I would be alone and allowed to just go freely. So that's really where the child in me comes in. I also feel like I carry tiny little April with me everywhere I go. And even though my tastes have changed in these 42 years of my life, drastically since I was little, I'm still able to very readily identify the things that little April would have liked and would have enjoyed. And she gets to get all kinds of little treats in my art. She gets rainbows in my art. She gets shapes and colors in my art that 42-year-old April wouldn't have put there.
Perfect. So good. We could talk for a lot longer. I just want to say, I think we probably need to wrap up at some time. You have told us where we can find you, where our listeners and viewers can find you. Could you just remind us again of the website, the podcast? Just give us a reminder of all of that kind of stuff, please.
Great. Will do. So the best place to start is Patreon and to subscribe there. And that's Patreon, patreon.com/April Kling Meyer. And that's AprilKlingmeyer. And then my podcast is Creativity is Spirituality. That can be found on Spotify, Apple, Google, Anchor.fm/April Kling Meyer. Anywhere that you find podcasts are distributed, Creativity is Spirituality, the podcast is there.
Excellent.
I
Thank you
love
very
it.
much.
April, thank you for being here. So thrilled to be able to chat with you. And I look forward to, I'm going to chat with you again soon because I still have to fill out the calendar to come for a little April chat and have coffee or something. But
Yeah.
I look forward to chatting with you soon. And thank you so much for being here and chatting with us about all things creativity and spirituality. It makes my soul come alive. James, I think so too. We're on a very similar journey. And so it's just beautiful to be able to have conversations with people we can relate to. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna ask another backup. I'm so curious about this. One last thing, James, and then you can shut me up.